I would like to point out that this is a review on the PC version and not the PlayStation or PlayStation VR version. Now, before I start this video, I would like to invite you and I both to take away any feelings we have about which games we feel are better and which ones suck entirely. That is not the focus of this video, and it's probably easier if we don't go into this already fully cocked, feeling superior, like the wrong type of fan who talks trash about others' opinions. Instead, I would like to just talk about what Resident Evil 7 is, and what resemblances from its predecessors the game's development has taken from. It is about dissecting the game and showing off what works and what doesn't feel like it's working as much. This video will contain as little spoilers as possible, so don't worry as I'll be sure to notify you ahead of time just in case. This game could very well be a polished game, but that doesn't mean you enjoy some features of the game. Either way, that is ultimately your decision to decide if it is worth it or not, and for what price. Breakdowns of this video will be in the description below, so be sure to check that first if you're only interested in some aspects of the game. I'll give you a moment, or you can pause the video before I move on to the first section of this review, which is overall story. The Resident Evil 7 story had me fairly curious and tremendously engaged within the first few minutes. This had been a Resident Evil story I had not encountered before, but whose premise I haven't seen before to an extent. The story begins with the main protagonist Ethan traveling to Louisiana after receiving a message from his wife, who was missing for 3 years. Her message revealed that she was sorry for lying to Ethan, and to stay away no matter what. Ethan ignores the message and goes anyway, only to find himself in an old plantation-like mansion that seems abandoned. Ethan ignores the message and goes anyway, only to find himself in an old plantation-like mansion. This mansion seems abandoned, but contains some of the most horrible things he will ever witness. I'm not going to dwell too deep on the details, as it would be the best to experience it for oneself, but the first encounter in the game is what sets the tone of how things will be till about 3/4 into the story. The story doesn't present itself too much on cutscenes, so it is up to the player to find out what is going on through the little snippets of paper, videotapes, and more that is lying around the house. Nothing doesn't really start tying itself into the main Resident Evil story until about halfway in, and the game tries to focus as much as possible on what is going on in the present of this house. The story never tends to drag on, and that was important to me, as there was always a secret I needed to learn. And this continued on until eventually the bigger picture presented itself. It left me with a oh shit moment after feeling dumb of a few certain facts that I probably should have been paying much attention to since the beginning of the game. These types of moments are what keep me to Resident Evil, and it is also the reason why I am such a big fan of the franchise. In this game, there was no city, no town, no apocalypse, but a small setting much like the first Resident Evil game. It brought what I would call a bit of familiarity, so to speak, into the overall tone of the story. It left me feeling as if I was trapped in this place rather than looking for Ethan's wife. It is also why I feel this exact feeling of being trapped is what benefited greatly to the game's overall tone for the player's experience. The voice acting was very believable, but one thing I did notice was that at times it felt awkward when certain people talked despite the performance of the voice actors. It could have been the way the faces looked or how the mouths tried to resemble the actors' performances, but I could never put my finger on why it felt so strange. In a way, that feeling turned to a sort of good thing, as it reminded me of how Silent Hill 1's voice actors were. Silent Hill 1 had some strange dialogue performances, but that game had an entire awkward thing going on when it came to their cutscenes. For the most part, the actors' performances were believable, more times than they were awkward, and it certainly gave me the sense of being in a horror film in this game, when I was traversing through the house. However, with horror, it is very difficult to keep that feeling for so long, and you could take any movie for example from my next point. I felt two types of horror while playing this game. The first was genuine horror while playing through the mansion because the Bakers truly are the stars of the show. Their unpredictable movement and uneasy dialogue is what carries this first and second act of this game's story along nicely. Unfortunately, too much exposure of anything and more times than none, a person can get used to whatever it is they are facing. This is just how some people are, and it's just them adapting, which is nice in its own way. This leads me to my second feeling of horror, which was more of a stress-related one than actually being scared. I felt scared that I didn't have any ammo during the halfway mark of the game, when you pretty much see everything inside the house. It is more about the enemies you face from that point, and that kind of feeling is only stress-scared rather than the feeling of genuine horror. After the hallway mark, it stopped being genuinely horrifying and more about just surviving with stress around every corner. Then comes the end, which ties the story very well together. The game does it in the same fashion it does since the beginning, with files lying around one can read and an area to find more on the truth. However, once I completed the game, it left me with more answers than it did feeling that were solved, which I did love and hate at the same time. Overall, in my opinion, the story does not disappoint, and it is a nice addition into the main timeline of Resident Evil. Resident Evil 7 is a first-person horror title, and for this reason alone, it has gotten praise, but what seems even more hate from players of the original Resident Evil series 0 to around Code Veronica. It is my belief that Resident Evil 7 takes a combination of both new and old from the franchise, and it makes an entirely new, refreshing take on the horror genre. In many cases, it even resembles to that of Resident Evil 1 for me, but with a first-person shooting camera. Many will disagree than those who do agree, and ever since I saw the announcement trailer for this game, I knew and defended its claim to becoming a worthy addition of the Resident Evil name, despite the song choice and Rhodey. I don't hate the song, but I never really got into the spirit of it either, which is despite the point of what I'm trying to make. Movement feels a bit tanky, such as that of the first few Resident Evil games. Here you can see an example of what I'm trying to express. Notice that the character controls feel and look similar to each other, but the only difference is the camera angles. Resident Evil 7 does allow for a customized sensitivity, but the tanky feel is still quite present, regardless. The game adopts the sense of what could be behind the door theme, just like the old games, but leaves out the old loading cutscenes. One of the strong key features of this game was the fact that you were rarely in a loading screen throughout the entire game. This was great as it didn't break the immersion. Every time you open a door, it reveals complete darkness for a few seconds, until finally revealing the area, and this is all done in a swift, elegant manner that I really appreciate for terms of immersion and a nod to the old Resident Evil style of opening doors. Doors can also be opened at the player's choice of speed, which can add to the tension even more if someone takes things slower. Combat is very responsive, and the game's options allows for a customized sensitivity so the tank controls don't feel too terrible. Regardless of this feature, players will still struggle with Ethan's hands swaying in and out while he holds a gun. Melee weapon combat is not to be trifled with lightly. You will find yourself having to fight the enemy with a melee weapon, and these guys do not go down so easily. So it is very important to know how to maneuver Ethan and time your blocks as well as attacks. Blocking is a new feature to Resident Evil, but it doesn't keep you safe for very long. Blocking serves as a means to minimize the damage you take if you are unable to maneuver in time away from the enemy's attacks. Blocking reduces the damage taken for only so long, but you will lose health regardless. Puzzles in the game were not that difficult, unless it was just me and I'm sort of genius savant, but I highly doubt that's the case. Even though they were easy, it didn't mean that they were not fun at all. Some of the puzzles give that classic Resident Evil feel to the game. Some of the classic puzzles, such as using a broken shotgun to obtain a repaired one, makes its way back to the franchise. It is very classic Resident Evil style, when the objective of the area is to find a specific item to unlock another. Oh, the classic safe room with the item box makes its return to Resident Evil, and it gives me that sense of being in a Resident Evil game all over again. Resident Evil's music playing throughout the duration of players in the safe room is something I've missed for a very, very long time. Resident Evil 4 and 5 had save themes similar to the old classic Resident Evil styles, but they were never in a safe room safe from the enemies and more of a checkpoint screen. When Resident Evil 6 came along, it didn't even have that classic safe room theme variation, and played different themes entirely. Now, 7's theme may not sound too similar to the old save themes, but what it does do is give that same feeling of Resident Evil. In fact, what you've been hearing this entire time is the music for Resident Evil 7's safe room. It was a nice moment of relief, knowing I could be in certain rooms and not have to worry about the enemies coming in. However, I did feel a sense of dread knowing the enemies were out there as soon as I left. This is exactly what Resident Evil should feel like, and has felt like, for Resident Evil 7. The status pulse is on a wristwatch this time around, and every time you check your inventory, Ethan will hold his hand up to show the player how badly he is injured. A player can increase Ethan's health and melee strength by finding or purchasing steroid shots with antique coins for using on bird cages. Enemies are no joke in this game, but they are not impossible to defeat either. Your focus will be on the Bakers for the most part of this first half of the game, with the exception of one enemy type. After that, it becomes less about the bakers and more on the enemies inhabiting the area. It is also because of this enemy focus that I felt less genuine horror and more of the stress horror I spoke of earlier. This isn't a bad thing for me, but it just changes the dynamic a bit of how the game feels. Halfway through the game, it turns to more action, and not having any ammo to defend off the enemies can place a lot of stress on the player's mindset, to think how they will tackle the onslaught toward the end of the game. The boss fights with the bakers are going to be some of the most memorable ones I've witnessed in a Resident Evil game for a very long time, but some of the end-game boss fights feel a little anticlimactic. There isn't a big, huge fight that feels like it could be some grander scale battle, and it's pretty much over before you know it. The ending sums the game up nicely, but the fights do little to nothing in my opinion to move the story in a place it could have been towards the end. In the beginning of the game, it did, don't get me wrong, but like I said, towards that halfway point, that's when it becomes a little, towards a different direction. And I think they probably could have done something differently there. Overall, the game took me a little over 11 to 12 hours to complete the game on normal, and I slightly took my time in some areas. There is an achievement to beat it in about 4 hours, I believe, so I will invest some time there as my next playthrough. So, in conclusion, this game mixed a great amount of new and old from the Resident Evil games, and combined them with what works today in a video game. It sent me on an emotional, horrific journey, which eventually turned into an action-style game to fulfill that fighting need I love in a video game. Overall, this game fulfilled my expectations on what a Resident Evil game is about, with the exception of a few things. But hey, some of the old Resident Evil games had some things I didn't like either. The inventory system, safe room and item box return, the genuine horror lurking around every corner, an interesting storyline mold this game into a worthy addition of the Resident Evil and Biohazard name. If what was said here interested you in the very slightest, then I recommend you try it out for yourself. Now, some may not agree with the price tag for a 12-hour story, and that is perfectly justified. Look online for discounts, as there are sites that can bring down the price as many as $20 off during release. I will be playing this game many times over, and cannot wait for the DLC to drop very soon and answer the many questions I still have. Thank you, Capcom, for what looks like, in my opinion, one of the best contenders for a Resident Evil title in a long time. Remember, it's easy to look and hate something with such disgust, but it all comes down to the very point that if you don't experience something for yourself, then it really isn't your opinion at all. Remember that. This has been your captain speaking, and I'd like to thank you for keeping an open mind during this entire video. I'll see you again, and welcome to the family. Enjoyed this review? Of course you didn't. That's because I suck, but maybe with your help you can tell me what you want to see more or less of. Leave a comment below and let me know. Join the Rockitech community today.